Hello, everyone. My name is Susanna Grego, and I'm a member of the Skoll Foundation team. It's so wonderful to see you all here today, and I can see you in the chat. I'm very excited to welcome you to this Skoll World Forum session, Bridging Divides for a Collective Future. We're delighted to have with us an impressive group of speakers here to learn from and engage with. But before we begin, I just want to share a few quick items. The session is being recorded and will be released publicly after the event. Language translation is available for this session, and you can access the translation options in the Translation tab to the right of your video window. Please feel free. In fact, we encourage you to use the chat to engage with each other and pose questions to our speakers. The moderator will turn to audience questions towards the end of the session. And on social media, we're using the hashtag SkollWF. If social media is your thing, we'd love for you to share your impressions and what you've been inspired by. After the session, you can join small group roundtable discussions on related topics by clicking the Discuss and Meetup button on the left side of your video screen. And with that, I'm very happy to turn it over to Shamil Idris, CEO of Search for Common Ground and a 2006 Skoll Foundation awardee. Over to you, Shamil.
Thanks, Susanna, so much. And thanks, everybody, for joining. It's really a thrill to be with you. Bridging Divides for a Collective Future. This conversation is as much about how we drive change as the change that we drive. Everyone has heard countless times the phrase of Gandhi that you need to be the change you want to see in the world. And yet we continue to see very adversarial approaches being taken to any number of issues that are supposed to create a more collaborative and just world together. And so really the fundamental question that a lot of us are facing right now, I think, is how do we meet these increasingly urgent challenges that require collective action when the collective seems like it's constantly being eroded or actively polarized? This phrase in the session description of deepening divides, I feel like, describes so many of our communities and our countries and the world at large. In the last year, UN Secretary General Guterres called the COVID pandemic a clear test of international cooperation, which we have essentially failed. More recently, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their latest report, which was really quite terrifying. It was a bit lost in the news because it came out right after the invasion of Ukraine. But it made clear just how far we're falling short of the action that we need to take. And it made the point that we still can actually take very effective action, but it's going to require collective political will and popular support now. So how do we generate that? Now, even if we look at the less global level at each of our own countries and communities, we see this sense of deepening division and polarization. And our speakers today are each really here, not only because they've driven and been at the forefront of driving extraordinary change in their own societies, but the way that they've done it, whether you want to call it an empathetic approach, a collaborative approach, a bridge building approach, is an approach that I think is increasingly needed. And many of us really don't have a lot of experience in how to apply those kinds of approaches. Eric Ward, you are the first American to win this Civil Courage Prize. You lead the Western States Center. I believe one of the taglines for the center is "We defend democracy." You're here in the United States as I am. Many of us in the US feel like we are as polarized and divided as we have been at any time, literally since the Civil War in this country. I know that you've been looking for examples from Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and other processes around the world to apply them to the long festering wounds and injustices in the US. Sonali Khan is with us. Sonali, you won the Skoll Award for Social Entrepreneurship in 2016, I believe it was, for your groundbreaking work advocating to end child marriage. You've been a dedicated human rights activist and powerful activist for many, many years. You're now the managing director for Sesame workshops programming across all of India. And you're living in a country where much of the world, given the importance of India, is very concerned about growing extremism and divisions in that country. And not all that far from you is Nawaz Mohammed in Sri Lanka. Nawaz, you and I are colleagues. You've been leading Search for Common Ground's programming in Sri Lanka since during the Civil War through to the end of the Civil War. You and your team developed a community memorialization and reconciliation process that has had a profound impact in reconciling Sinhalese and Tamil communities, both inside Sri Lanka and among the diaspora. But in addition to that bridge building work, you've also been at the forefront of some real advocacy, for instance, in getting more quotas for women's participation in parliament in Sri Lanka, that has seen a big increase in women's role in government. And all of this you've done with this sort of collaborative, kind of bridge building approach. And yet you had to go to a hotel to join us today because things have deteriorated so much in your own country that we didn't even know if you'd have electricity to join now. And the tensions are really on the rise there again in Sri Lanka. So each of you, frankly, I don't say this word lightly. You are heroic figures to me as somebody who believes in not only the possibility of driving profound change with a collaborative approach, but the demonstrated efficacy of doing it. And so what I want to do is I ask each of you just a couple of questions, and then feel free, obviously, to jump in and interject if you hear anything from others that you want to comment on or ask each other. And then we'll open this up to our many audience members. And I think the first thing I want to ask you, because I think for every social change activist, there is the what are you trying to achieve and the how are you going to achieve it. And each of you has adopted this bridge building approach, to the change that you've driven. And I just want to understand, were you born this way? Is there something in your professional background or your personal experience that led you to apply this kind of an approach? And Nawaz, maybe I'll just start with you, and then we'll go around.
Thanks, Hamil. Hi, everyone. I was born in eastern Sri Lanka, which was part of the war zone, and I grown up as a young person in Sri Lanka amidst of several insurgencies, deep violence, civil war, and all of that. And I have seen really brutal violence across my school, my hometown, including a mosque massacre in my hometown, which killed 150 people, including children who were praying at the mosque at that time. And I also lost my own brother, sister, and 3 maternal uncles while I was a young person. And all of this created, anger and frustration and wanting to take revenge kind of feelings in me as a young person. And the options to opt for violence approaches, adversarial approaches, was also very freely available. Luckily for my mother, who was, well connected with other communities, who I was thinking as perpetrators and was wanting to take revenge, helped me to, better understand and connect with other communities, initially as a young person, which has led me to where I am today as a searcher, as a peace builder, working here in Sri Lanka as well as in other places to, build collaborative approaches for better society.
Nawaz, thank you so much for sharing that. And I happen to know that, but I feel privileged that the rest of us can hear a bit of just a little bit of that story. And it's interesting that you say adversarial, even violent approaches were very available. I think increasingly they are very available, particularly in social media spaces and a lot of our communities. Sonali, let's go to you. You led human rights advocacy. Human rights advocacy oftentimes is seen as some of the more adversarial approaches, and I don't want to pretend that adversarial approaches are never needed. I just think we're way over invested in them. What in your background led you to take this kind of an approach?
Shamil, if I think back, my work on gender-based violence, working on the issue of early and child marriage was the journey I took that also finally brought me to work with Sesame Workshop, which works with children. If I look at this journey and I think about the work with women and girls, actually there is no plan B. We can't go down the road of conflict if you just think about it. In any case of disruption, conflict, displacement, we get affected most severely. Yeah. So we just have to go down this path of bridge building, collaboration, if we really want any solutions. When I look at the work at Sesame, where bridge building is kind of baked into the methodology, I think through the thread through in my work on women's rights at Breakthrough, the one piece that I really want to sort of foreground is the narrative of changing hearts and minds. I mean, that's the piece. If you change the hearts and minds, you connect with them, you change social norms, and you change behaviors. It's an approach that builds trust, but mind you, it's a bold approach. Yes, it's non-adversarial, but it's really bold. If I look back at the work on domestic violence, ring the bell, look at the current work, some of the work we are doing, My Planet, My Home, on building children's ability to become environment stewards, or Coming Together, which is talking about understanding racism at Sesame, to talk about discrimination. These are really bold ideas. They are about building bridges. So this is my journey. Yeah, the journey which sort of plants the seed of hope and resilience. But I think one of the biggest messages that one has been giving all along, whether it's a girl who is a young adolescent girl who could be married off early, a woman who sort of faces abuse in her own and believes she's alone, or a child in a refugee camp who has been living there for 5 years, no other life, knows no other life. I think the one message that we are really giving out, and I think that's which is very key to building bridges, is that we are not alone in this. And this is the journey, and this is the thought that has really been the driving thought in building empathy-based approaches to solving, these kinds of conflictual situations that are arising in our daily lives. And there seems to be a war zone everywhere. If you look at a young girl in a village, or you look at an urban center, or you look at what's happening in some of the most war-torn zones. So I think this has been a journey where one has just learned that it has to come from the heart.
Thank you, Sonali. Thank you very much. I mean, there's just a thread in what you said that I kind of want to underscore. That on the one hand, we're not alone. On the other hand, we have no other choice. And I think those two things are actually true of the world at large. Whether we like it or not, we are really bound together now. And some of us in our societies would rather not be and say, I don't want to live with these people anymore. But I think it's really a question of how are we gonna manage this collective reality? And Eric, you're right at the forefront of this here in the US, which is experiencing such extreme divisions these days. Tell us a little bit about your background. What got you to embrace this sort of collaborative approach, empathy-based approach?
Absolutely. It's wonderful to see everyone on here, and so appreciative of the opening. It has been a hard time globally for all of us who seek a more inclusive society that's grounded in equity and opportunity. And no different than here in the United States, we're at a point where political partisanship is driving us apart. I live in Portland, Oregon. Most folks might know it from the comedy show, Portlandia, right? But it is also the city where African Americans are more likely to die from violence than any other city in America, meaning even more than Washington, D.C. or Baltimore, Atlanta, or Chicago. The racial disparities are quite significant. In terms of demographics, it is a region that is only about 2% African American, and depending on how the Latino community identifies racially, is somewhere between 85% to 97% white. On top of that, we live in the West, and in the West, in the Pacific Northwest, there's a strong anti-authoritarian tendency, and it manifests itself politically, right, with libertarians on the right and, of course, anarchists on the left. The recent change in administration in 2017, the arrival of Donald Trump, significantly escalated tensions here, Shamil, in Portland, Oregon, from political marches that turned into street brawls to the fact that even last month, 5 anti-racist racial justice activists were shot in a park by a right-wing vigilante as they were preparing for an anti-policing march. One of those individuals, activist June Knightley, was killed. I'd like to say that that is unique in our region, but over the course of 4 years, 11 people have been shot from political gun violence, and 3 people killed, right, across the political spectrum, right, from alt-right activists, right, to racial justice activists. It is a volatile moment in this region. Again, I say that in context, understanding what is happening globally, but I speak here in the United States. For myself, I came to understand sometime in 2015, 2016, I was having a conversation with an individual who used to be one of the significant leaders and strategists in the white nationalist movement. And and he had left, and he and I were kind of sharing notes about the moments that we had found ourselves in. And it was in that conversation that I realized that as a human rights activist, I was missing a key point, that I had been so focused on political ideology and where folks stood ideologically that I had forgotten that values were more likely to align us in a moment of great political strife where COVID has actually accelerated this moment. I really began to lean back into some of my subcultural roots. I came up in the music scene in Los Angeles in the 1980s, the early 80s, in the punk rock scene. I often say I'm an old punk rocker who still goes to too many punk shows.
So Eric, I'm gonna ask you just to wrap it. So
yeah.
you've just gotten to the. I know your rock band history, which is unusual and wonderful.
We'll make folks Google that. We'll make folks Google that. But what I will say just in closing, it was in the subculture, right, that we had to figure out how to bring together diverse settings to move us forward together. And it is those skill sets that we have brought into this moment into the Pacific Northwest.
Well, Eric, I think that's a perfect segue. And, you know, as you all are talking, I'm watching the comments and we've got people saying, hey, someone else from Sri Lanka, and hey, I'm in Portland, and other people. So that's great. And I want to encourage people, feel free to put in who you are in the comments. Also, feel free to put in questions. We're going to turn to the audience in a second. I just have two more questions that I want our panelists to relate to. And Eric's led us into one of them, which is the how. Okay, this is all very good. There's no choice. We all, you know, there's no plan B, as Sonali has said. We need to figure out how to change hearts and minds, you know, whatever. But let's be explicit and practical. Can you each just share like one or two, just a couple specific tools or tactics that you have found to be really effective in applying this kind of collaborative approach? And Sonali, I think maybe I'll just start with you this time. Just give us some pointers, if you would.
Yeah, so, you know, when one looks back and has, you know, worked on several of these approaches in very trying situations, and sometimes, you know, struggle with not seeing change happen, because in many of the cases when you work on gender rights, you seem as if you're taking 2 steps forward and you take one, I mean, it's 1 step forward and 2 steps back, right? So I would sort of look at it in a couple of ways, which are sort of, in my experience, have been my guiding approaches. One is, how do you put the perspectives and the interest of those we serve at the heart of what we do? Yeah, how do you make that process inclusive, participatory, and really trust in it? Because sometimes, you know, we just believe we can do it. We know it. We are social activists. We lead organizations. We are, you know, we are educated, or we are much more well spoken. We have the platform. So we just believe we know it, and we want to lead the process. But just how do we trust the communities that we work in? And the third point that I want to sort of build in is, how do you build communities? So because we work with vulnerable populations, we work with young children, we work with women at risk, how do you ensure that there is no backlash and that there is that community support? So in building a non-adversarial, in a bridge building, that's where these are the 3 kind of pillars. And I'll sort of lay out a couple of examples so that people can get a sense of how this can work. You know, when we look at, you know, children, for example, we are, as Sesame, we are probably working in some of the most war-torn zones in the Syria response region, in Cox's Bazar, where you know, the Rohingya children are growing up in these huge refugee camps. How do you put, you know, really sort of connect with those children? How do you make them believe that we respect them, that we value them, that we are listening to them, right? And create engagement, a development for them that works for them. So I think it's somewhere that, you know, where is that hard connect? With Sesame, we created 2 characters, Aziz and Noor. They are 2 Rohingya children. First time we are producing content in educational content, multimedia in Rohingya language. So children are seeing Aziz and Noor. They relate to them. They understand their stories. You know, they get solutions. They get ideas. And most of all, we are building bridges and building trust. That's so key to how we work. If we sort of think about process, listening to children's voices, sometimes as adults, we are very quick in sort of attributing to what children should be thinking or what they think. So when we were working with children on building their their environment stewardship on a program, My Planet, My Home. And you spoke about this, Shamil. Children are completely missing in the environment discourse. We are talking about, the whole catastrophe that we are facing. Children are going to inherit that. They don't have any say in it. So as we include them in this process, it's humbling. It's amazing to see that they know, they understand, they appreciate, they know what is critical. We just have to give them that voice, that space to have that conversation. So I think that's really key, that we trust them and we bring them in. And the last point I really want to make on community action, I think this sort of came to me when I was working, and you sort of raised it up front with adolescent girls who were facing early marriage. They were like a blind spot in society. Nobody saw them, nobody heard them. They could get married off early. Now, one believes that we need to stand for our rights. Now, I'm educated, I speak up, I have. As a woman, I still have vulnerabilities. If you say do something, go out at night alone, I'd still hesitate, right? So you hear talking about a girl in rural India, with several levels of disadvantage, to stand up, protest early marriage. I mean, that's really difficult and tough. So in that case, in everything that we do, how do we build in community action, bring in her parents, bring in the stakeholders? Without that, there is no likelihood of solutions. So to your point, Shamil, again and again we stress that these are very tough problems, but we need to trust people. We need to get them into a process where they feel that they are being heard. That
Sonali, I got to ask you, because this is great, but I have to ask you, because you said something right at the outset about how do you do this without triggering I think you said backlash or blowback or whatever, and in increasingly polarized societies, and I think each of you did, like, just even real quickly, when you think about, okay, I'm going to help advance this issue or that issue, I'm going to listen to young people, I'm going to bring community members in. How about the community members that gee, if I don't handle this right, they're going to see this as a threat?
Shamil, one of the things that we've got stuck in is that we've got stuck in echo chambers. We mostly talk to each other in a language that only we understand. So the first thing we need to do is, in a way, to build a bridge, you need to sort of come out of our comfort zone and engage with the non-converted. And I think that's where the journey begins. So even if you're talking on, say, an issue on early and child marriage, you're talking on domestic violence, I think the first thing you do is bring men and women into the same room. We just can't be talking to women to end violence. Where is the relationship with men? So I think that's the conversation. If you want to end a polarized world, you need to bring people to have that conversation. I know it's not easy. I mean, one is not being naive by saying this, but one has tried it again and again. Is there another solution? Do you have another solution? No.
Thank you, Sonali. Thank you very much. Nawaz, I want to pick up on that, because you shared, the very harrowing, just personal experience that you had. And so you said your mother in particular was quite critical in guiding you away from kind of a thirst for vengeance for the violence that had torn your family apart. And there's a question in the comments for you too, Nawaz. We can get into that later, but you might touch on some of it, like, given the deepening crisis in your country, what's the role of peace builders? So maybe before we get into that bigger question, just one or two tools or tactics, like how have you gone about applying this kind of approach in such a divided society?
Yeah. I will focus on a couple of tools as examples, just to set a bit of light on the topic. So one, us, Search for Common Ground, and a couple of other partners have used this tool around, using memory, memorialization, and history as a way to kind of, on one side, help people to really come out and speak their truth, and to kind of, create this space for people's history, people's narrative, people's truth. In a context where truth is a big commodity, and is a bit dangerous, risky, highly politicized aspect, right? So then what we do is we on one side we help that. On the other side, we bring these into exhibitions. We bring these into dialogue sessions where we bring in the others who have very little access or had no information about this history and memory and memorialization, which the others have had to live through during violence, and their experience through violent history, right? And how history is manipulated for different reasons, for political and other reasons. So all of these, like different people, it's students, local politicians, religious leaders from different areas and from different communities, go through this experience of, kind of, so this helps them to really, rethink a bit, challenging their attitudes and challenging some of the stereotypes they carry, which were not really their fault, for decades, they had very limited information, and the information was from limited sources. Some of the sources that were politically controlling them, and some of the sources that were controlling them through media and other sources, right? So we through this, some of us has reached thousands of different stakeholders who really have had a transformative experience and a journey which we want to build a critical moment in Sri Lanka, which critically think about some of these really polarizing, really divisive aspects that play to continue to keep us divided, right? And we also made this to different levels. Most of these stories are archived in the National Archives, so this has become part of the history. And we have brought some of these stories into mobile museums. We have brought these stories into a virtual museum, virtual archiving, which are being used abroad and by diaspora and all of that. So that's one tool that I would like to mention. And the second tool I would like to mention, Sonali, you touched a little bit about media. So we actually produced and telecasted 2 television soap operas in Sri Lanka during the context of the kind of the national reconciliation process, where some of the key challenges were around division among the different communities and the different stakeholders in really grasping as to what reconciliation means for us. What do we expect from reconciliation? What do we expect from a national reconciliation process, right? So this deep division and the inability of the state and the key stakeholders to really mobilize and get all the different communities and the nation along a shared vision for the future was a real critical issue. So we produced and telecasted these soap operas, really bringing in narratives that help people to really think about this, to think about it in ways that they have not thought about it before, to bring in narratives and visuals that they haven't seen in the mainstream media before, bring in new conversations that was not part of the conversations before. So you do it in a very edutainment way that so we actually use a popular television, like a popular media format, and we also used popular TV channels. We used popular artists, so it was like any other soap opera, but the narrative was cutting edge and was very very transformative in terms of and we have had viewership groups and evaluations and so on, which showed a lot of people have really had different experiences and transformative experiences by engaging through that. And we had good reach both through screen but also through online. So we also had a strategy in terms of how to engage the different audiences. The last tool I would like.
Yeah, just be real brief on your last one.
I can also hold that. We can come back.
Okay. All right, we can come out to that. And I do want to just, both you and Sonali have talked about using narrative, right? Storytelling, narratives, visuals. But another thing I heard from both of you, and we didn't coordinate any of this before. I mean, you knew the questions I was going to ask, but you both, you're talking a lot less about messages you're trying to get out to people and a lot more about providing platforms for people to tell their own stories and for people to be heard and feel heard, which is really kind of interesting. And, I'm thinking about you, Eric, as Nawaz talks about using, and it was interesting, Nawaz, you didn't say that you had people talk about Sri Lanka's history. You said you had people talk about their own history. right? And that collective is something that's really important. It can be easy for me to argue with you about your version of the history of my country, but it's tough for me to argue about your version of your own history, of what you've been through, what your family's been through. Because Eric, as I'm thinking and turning to you now, we know in this country, the huge history is not exactly a unifying theme in this country. We're having huge debates about which Civil War monuments come up and come down. So maybe, Eric, if you could just share any insights, one or two tactics or tools that you found to be really effective.
Absolutely. And in this moment, right, the great debate, regardless of the issue in America, is who's an American and what will America look like? And it is one that has largely been set by politics. So the first tool, Shamil, in our toolbox that we think is critically important, right, is values over ideology, right? In storytelling, how we introduce and talk to one another cannot be grounded in whether we're left or right or Democrat or Republican. It's about what values do we think are important: joy, safety, opportunity. So that's become critically important. The second is we chose very early on as Western State Center, right, not to directly engage paramilitaries or white nationalists. What we meant by that is that we did not position them as the problem or the opposition. We refused to buy into, right, the back and forth dehumanization and othering that was going on. Instead, in this second tool, we understood that if the practice of democracy was to prevail, that civil society, particularly governance, needed to step up in this moment and show leadership. So you will find in our second tool that most of our focus was getting government institutions and civil society to step up, right, in this moment, rather than direct confrontation with paramilitary groups. The third piece is we felt it was critically important to match tone and energy without matching tactics. And what I mean by that is in Portland, Oregon, right, we were having nightly marches, right? Racial justice activists were having nightly marches against police brutality. Law enforcement was on the streets in a very draconian manner. You had armed paramilitary folks, right, out on the streets each and every night. And we felt the tone and the energy was very clear. We couldn't deny the energy and tone that was happening on the streets. But we knew that we needed to provide a different set of tactics without dismissing, right, the tone and energy. Asking people to calm down is not an effective tool. Providing people alternatives, right, to expressing that anger became very, very important. So those are some of the lessons we learned in terms of tools. The last was to create courageous spaces where we could bring together folks who may have differing opinions, right, in the same room. And what we found out ultimately, Shamil, was the way to do that was not to discuss the crisis at hand. Everyone had an opinion and a strong position on those. So we turned to other things to try to expand conversations around food safety, right? Educational access, ways to try to build a new common understanding of what it meant to be American. In short, the tool was seeking expansion, bringing us out of the silos that Sonali spoke of, right? And setting new tables. But we can't set new tables as NGOs, right? We can't set the size of the tables that are needed. It has to be government that steps in this moment because the scale of the problem outweighs most abilities of NGOs to respond on their own. The last thing I'll say, Shamil, just to keep an effort on size, a lot of critique has been thrown at Portland city government, right, in terms of the conditions that are existing in Portland. And we felt it was important to understand that Portland, Oregon, on its best day, right, did not have the historical experience nor the resources to manage what was actually a national problem that was playing out on the streets of Portland, Oregon. And while folks didn't listen, we believe after January 6th, everyone now understands that Portland was one of the training grounds for what became the January 6th insurrection. And so it's not just a local problem. It takes a partnership with state and federal government And as we've come to realize, I'll talk about later, right? International cooperation, the ability of us to break out of American exceptionalism and to humbly reach out to organizations outside the United States and leaders outside the United States asking for help has become one of the most significant tools in our toolbox.
Thank you, Eric, really very much. Thanks to all of you. So we've got some, I know I've got another question I want to ask, but I want to open this up because we've got questions coming in the comments. And so I'll come back to you before we close, because at the end of the day, I think choosing this approach to driving change is very inspiring, very fulfilling, at least from my experience and from the people I'm humbled and honored to know, and is very challenging oftentimes, can be very personally challenging. So I'm going to want to come to you before we end to just have you each reflect on, one challenge you really face in applying this kind of approach and how you deal with it, especially for those who are out there who are attracted by this approach and need some encouragement on how to do it. But we've got two questions here. One, Nawaz, for you, which is really, given the deepening crisis in your country right now in Sri Lanka, well, how are you going about applying this approach now to try and address the intercommunal tensions? And then there's this other question, Sonali, which I want to start with you, which really talks about, well, okay, how do you, when you're talking about children in particular, how do you reach children whose attitudes are being shaped by maybe very insular communities or by very, sometimes the older generation is not so open and kind of hands down these divisions and these biases, to children. So I'm going to turn to each of you to speak on that, and we'll just take the conversation from there. I will note something before, Nawaz, I turn to you on Sri Lanka, that Eric and Nawaz, you both said things that reflect your ability to refrain judgment in a world that is increasingly very judgmental. Nawaz, you said we would invite people in. It wasn't their fault that they didn't know the histories of these other people. I know a lot of activists who will say, it is your fault if you don't know the full history of your country, educate yourself, and it's become a point. And Eric, you talked about having, white nationalists and extremists and kind of positioning as, you're not the problem. We have a shared problem. You're not. That's just something I want to pull out from what you both said that can be very difficult stance for people to take these days, but sounds critical to me. Nawaz, do you want to talk about, current day Sri Lanka with the tensions? What role do you see peace builders playing?
Yeah, so to be brief, I'll focus on a couple of points. So one is that there's unfinished reconciliation process and business in Sri Lanka still hanging over. That's still a lot more work for everyone, the entire nation, all the stakeholders, communities, people. So there's a lot around that. People still have, not found out, they are missing people, there's lots and lots of things that need to happen. Secondly, the current situation is encouraging from a citizen activism perspective, which we haven't seen in Sri Lanka. We always complain, we complain and we compare it to India and other places. Citizens were like largely passive in terms of, really asking for, demanding and fighting for, rights and change. So this time it was a completely unexpected, a complete citizen-led, a real encouraging struggle that's going on, which is encouraging on one hand, but on the other hand, there's a lot of violence, divisive elements that are coming into play within that, struggle, and we are really concerned that the years of work by everyone to create a non-violent culture, to create a culture that's about non-recurrence of violence, right? After decades of violent culture, so we are really concerned that whether this in a way would get us back, and then we may need to be working on that. That's the second aspect. The third aspect is the current crisis, and the whole struggle is about economic crisis and how do we get out of this economic crisis, right? Whereas there's a lot of beautiful things happening within it. How the different communities are really working together in protest. How they are really recognizing, how they are even countering some of the ill-gotten divisive campaigns that some elements are trying to plant within this struggle to kind of disorient and to, divert the attention. So these are all coming out beautifully. A big challenge that's in all of our hands is that how do we sustain this? These can come in, like real peak moments, and then, but how do you really sustain these aspect of, how important it is for all the different communities in Sri Lanka to really work together collectively to come out of this struggle, not just the economic struggle, but all the different struggles that we face as a nation. So I see there's a lot of different ways that there'll be, important role for people who promote and work for peace.
Thanks very much, Nawaz. And I will share this story just because we all need a little bit of help. I hope. I'll never forget that when the former president of your country, the first woman head of state of your country, was sitting next to her. She was being honored by us, and she grabbed my arm and pulled me down to my ear close to her mouth, and she said, "You need to understand, what a powerful peace builder, Nawaz is." And I said, "I thank you. I understand." I thought she was going to threaten me or something. That was beautiful. I think Sonali, and I think more power to you, Nawaz, in this current situation there. And I think we're all really concerned with what we're seeing. I think Sonali, how about this question of, you're trying to reach, on the one hand, you've got the platform of Sesame Workshop. Okay, so that helps a lot because you've got a very popular, but you weren't always with Sesame. Like, how do you reach communities, and particularly young people in communities? And Eric, I think you'll have some insights into this too, who might be quite insular and not at all open to the kind of equity and justice, that kind of advocacy that you've done your whole life.
This is really a big question, because when you say if they're insular, they're this sort of not open. I think the way we use popular culture, that's a big one. I know Ward spoke about music. It's something that we can use to break boundaries. Is use popular culture, whether it be be theater, be music. I think Nawaz spoke about extensively about these mechanisms to bring the voices of different communities and people into the mix. But I think when I really you table this question, that in a world that is becoming highly toxic, where there is stress in every kind, COVID just exacerbated all of that in different ways. When I was hearing Ward, when I was hearing Nawaz speak, one was just realizing that this is the world that our youth, our children are going to inherit, women are living in, and to that, it's a question that how do we really challenge this? What is that new conversation? Who are these peace builders we are constantly talking about? So I think from that perspective, I really think I would just want to uplift that point, is how do we create that conversation? You spoke about the platform of Sesame. It's really powerful because, every time Sesame has brought in, just recently we introduced a very new Muppet, a Korean American Muppet, Ji Young. It was just amazing to see the reception she got. We are a world which are facing racism and discrimination in varied ways. Yeah. And that's what is needed. How do those voices get reflected in popular culture? They are absent. So if you look at voices in India, if it is it's a girl who comes, just look at the vulnerability. She's not only poor, she's underage, she's below young, she lives in a rural India, she's she may not finish her education. How do you get her voice out there? So I think this is the most powerful thing to do. So as in all my work around, I think what I have done, I have been singularly humbled by the voices that I have had the opportunity to bring out. Whether it is a girl living in remote Rajasthan, a woman in maybe a multi-story condominium who faces violence, to bring her voice out, to tell her story. I think that's been the journey of change, Shamil. Yeah, and I think
I have to say that in one of the things, and I may be projecting here, so feel free to contradict me, any of you, but as you're each talking, one of the things that strikes me is that you're really talking about things that hit on emotions. It's not about, rational debate or argumentation or this policy position or whatever. It is giving people the experience of being heard and listened to, enabling somebody to see on television someone who represents their community where maybe they never saw them before, There's a lot of using arts, music. These are not rational things. It's not that the rational isn't important, but as I listen to each of you, you're talking about tactics and approaches that really seek to understand universal human needs that are fundamentally emotional and social, at least as much, if not more so, than rational. And that's something when driving change that seems to me is really important to sort of tap into. And I guess, Eric, and there's a question in the comments. Eric, I'll let you speak to that question as well if you want to talk about how to reach communities that are maybe a bit more closed off, and particularly young people. Maybe you can put in your music history thing that I cut you off on earlier. But I want to, as you're doing that, I want to raise for Nawaz and Sonali this question, and eventually, Eric, for you too, because somebody's raised the point about just the inequities and the power. There are huge, disparities. There are disparities in our own countries. There are disparities globally. And this all sounds really good in terms of these collaborative and empathy-based approaches. What about, is it true? There's just not a whole lot that you can do with this approach when at the end of the day, we need some transfer of wealth, or we need some transference of power. And, the adage that power is never ceded willingly. Okay, well, how do you deal with that? So this is a looming thing over this whole conversation that I'd welcome, any of your thoughts on, and then we'll wrap this up. But Eric, let me first come to you if you want to speak to either of those questions.
Yeah, those are great questions. So I'll start in reverse. The first thing we have to understand is that there are many approaches that must happen, right? And we're talking about one that is grounded in bridge building and peacemaking. And I think it's important for us to understand, someone once very famous quipped back to the media, one doesn't make peace with your friends, one makes peace with your enemy. And that is really important for us to hold, and we hold that at Western State Center. So quickly, Shamil, we think in terms of outreach, the first thing one has to be willing to do is to listen, right? And that is a difficult thing to do in a moment where tension is at its highest, right? But it's important to present oneself as a potential bridge, right? Where at least, even if you're not agreeing, you are known to at least listen and to hear. So that's the first. And it takes a lot of courage, right? Because when you assume what is perceived to be the middle ground, though I would call it the most radical ground, right? But when it's perceived you are holding the middle ground, it creates tension on other sides, right? You become discombobulation that doesn't allow sides to completely kind of gel. But you have to hold that space courageously. Next, you have to utilize various mediums. The problem is that we have become over-reliant on social media as a form of connection, and it is insufficient unto itself. So you have to use other mediums, including, right, putting folks back into the field, right, where there are face-to-face conversations. That simply takes more resources, right, in the midst of a pandemic. We are watching in terms of pieces, but it must be done. Third, it has to be rewarding, right? If peacemaking is not as rewarding as violence, right? We are never going to effectively be able to compete. And what we have found to be rewarding for folks is that folks really want out of their political ideologies, right? And what I would point to really quickly, because I would unpack this, one of the role models or case studies that we've looked at is actually a cultural musical moment that occurred in the UK called the two-tone movement, right? It was the rise of a fusion of ska and punk music that sought to brand itself, right, as a black and white social movement. Now, it had its own weaknesses, but at the end of the day, the important lesson was it created an alternative identity. Now, it didn't subsume the racial identities and the class identities that we have to walk through, but it provided another alternative for folks to forge a new common identity. So did punk rock, right? So does soccer, right? There are other aspects that allow people to build those identities, and we need to help formulate and resource the ability of that to happen in inclusionary ways. We have to model what we want.
Yeah, Sonali, please go ahead,
Yeah,
Sonali.
so what I mean, Eric, I think you've said just so powerful things. And there's only one point that I want to add. Any of these scenarios, Shamil, whether what Nawaz has sort of laid out for us, Eric in Portland, whatever, the scenario, what does it do to anyone? It gives a person a sense of helplessness, right? It also makes me feel I can't do anything. Now that's the feeling we need to turn around. And that's what when we say we are NGOs, we are, how much can we do? That's what we need to change. And in my experience in working on women's rights, the first thing I learned to acknowledge is that every day a woman exhibits agency and makes choices. And there is power, and in that power, there is change. Now, how do you harness that? And that's where and when you said like there are these big problems, how do you bring about change? And when you look at that big problem, immediately you say, I can't do anything, right? So when I began my journey on talking about domestic violence, which is a pandemic, every household has it. We talk about war because that's so visible, but you don't talk about the war that's at home. And there, what are we trying to do? What is the narrative that you're trying to overturn? That everyone can make a difference. And I think that's the power that we are talking about, Shamil. And that's the helplessness that we need to change. Because every situation that makes you feel helpless also makes that situation intractable. So we need to overturn that narrative. So with everything, whether we are talking about domestic violence in a household, as soon as we empower a person, makes me feel as an individual, I can do something, you start changing the narrative. So to everything that Ward has said, this is one message that I feel that needs to be put out, is that everybody can make a difference. Everybody has the agency, and it's not that the most disempowered, you feel they're disempowered. Actually, they're not. A young girl who I spoke about, who we feel needs all kinds of help to end her early marriage, but she's still spunky. She has the ability. Just give her the opportunity, give her that little bit. It's not about me helping her, me just giving her a little bit of support, which makes her fly. So it's that's what we are talking about.
Sonali, thank you very much for that. And there, so Nawaz, let me come to you, and then I'm going to ask each of you to just think, because we only got a few minutes left, and I'm going to give you each literally less than a minute. So just one challenge which you dedicating your lives to this kind of an approach, and how you deal with it. Just people who are thinking of moving more into this kind of approach to driving social change can be inspired by that. Nawaz, do you want to say anything on what either Eric or Sonali just spoke to?
Yeah. So a quick example, in Sri Lanka had the lowest percentage in terms of women political representation in entire Asia. And then it was like a 2 decade of struggle in terms of getting women quota. And then there was this collaborative approach where, it's not just, women political leaders, the feminist movements, others, and then also, reaching out to those who normally, we don't like to reach out to, the political parties, the political power brokers, and, making sure that, all the different pieces move. Of course, there's this big power dynamics, and, there's this big disparity. But how do you ensure that you do it in a way that it helps to move, like Eric said, some of these things need big table. You really need the politicians to pass this law in the parliament, and then so that is an important element in terms of getting some of these big successes in terms of policies and laws and so on. So a 25% quota in a country where historically the women's representation was below 5% was possible through that kind of an approach. Of course, there were a lot of this agitation as well. There had been protests, all of that. But then you really need to bring this aspect in that process at a point where, if you want to really move it to the next level, right? So I just want to mention that example. And then one last point on that. It is also important that we can solve one problem, using a lot of different approaches, even adversarial approaches. But the beauty of using collaborative approach to solve a problem is transformative. That helps to maintain that relationship for you to work on even much more complex, even more difficult issues in the future. So the way that you really engage and you build understanding and empathy towards each other is a big part of that whole process. And it's not just the outcome of that problem, how you solve that problem. You might even not solve that problem, right? But tomorrow you might solve a bigger problem together. So I just want to say that. And
No,
then
thank you.
one challenge. Can I
Thank
also
you for
finish
that.
my
Yeah,
challenge?
I'm gonna cut you off for a second. I'm gonna do the challenges right now.
Sure.
I just want to put a fine point on what you just said, because a lot of what you've all talked about is you've held. It sounds to me like you're holding two things present always at the same time. You're holding the issues, and you're depersonalizing the issues. So you're not the problem, but this issue is a problem. So you're holding the issues, but you're also holding the relationships. Sonali talked about creating community. You all talked about creating venues that bring people together. So you're holding both the issues and the relationships at the same time. And the way it sounds to me like you're advancing is that you are always driving both of them towards advancement, strengthening both the relationships and the tackling of the issues and the injustices. And it's an art and a science, but it's very inspiring to have the three of you who are masters in it. So we've got about 40 seconds or so each. Well, I want to close with your words, not mine. So I'm going to say in advance, thank you to the Skoll Foundation for providing this, and thank you to everyone who's participated. And Leon, sorry we can't get to how to solve Ukraine-Russia in this moment, but can you each just note one challenge that you face in applying this approach and how you deal with it, and then we'll wrap. I'll start with you, Sonali.
I think when we are talking about very tough issues, there is a huge desire to go head on. But when there's a moment of creating empathy, I think it's just like light in every which way. And I'll just give you an example because that will speak more loudly than any word I can say. When I was working with these young boys and girls, and we were talking about violence that girls face, one of the girls actually spoke up and said that young boys face more sexual abuse and nobody talks about that. And that sort of broke every barrier, every polarity that's there, because girls who face daily harassment could speak up about boys. And that's building bridges and creating empathy.
Thank you, Sonali. Aaron.
Yes. I mean, as a young activist and an adult, right, who spent many times saying no justice, no peace, right? We are a moment in the United States that I think is a big challenge. And I think we have underrated the importance of peace in terms of advancing social justice and inclusion in a multiracial society. And I think we ignore peace building in this moment at our own peril. And I think that is the greatest challenge. We have lived under deep racism and inequality for so long, right, that we are looking for accountability. But let's not forget the importance of peace as we look for accountability as well.
That may be my tweet out from this panel. We've underrated the importance of peace and the advancement of social justice. Nawaz, I will end with you.
Yeah, so it is very challenging to work with people on the topics of hope and collaboration in a context where most of the things are fragile and people really expecting things that are not changing in their lives. They have these expectations and hope for a longer period which are not really changing for them, but we are still kind of trying to work with them and build their agency to really work it out. So that moment is very challenging, when people really look up and question, that reality is a very challenging thing. So it's really been a privilege to be with the three of you in this panel. And thank you, and thanks also for Skoll for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. I think just sharing this panel has been just amazing.
More power to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.